Our next segment is segment 3, and it is brought to us by Dr. Otho Wells of the University of New Hampshire. Otho was a bit diminutive in his introductory comments as a member of the first panel. But those of you who have been following high tunnel production for a number of years know that Otho has had a significant part in all of it. And I hope that, well, I'm certain that will come clear in his upcoming comments. But he does have quite a few years' experience, both in the research and the extension side on high tunnel production. And we've asked him today to spend a few minutes to talk about the limits of high tunnel production in terms of what is possible season extension-wise and profit potential. Now, we've heard a number of comments already today about what crops to grow, what varieties to grow, do you choose what sells, what do you put in a high tunnel, and so on. So I suspect that the comments that Otho will offer are not going to answer each and every question about, well, will that be profitable for you? The question, I think, is more along the lines of what has he seen that has worked, that doesn't work, and some of the factors to consider. And I'll just leave with one final prompt. When I had the good fortune of speaking with Elliot Coleman in another program on season extension and high tunnels, I had a sense for what he might be bringing out there. And having lived in Maine before, I know that he has bright, clear winter days. It could be 5 below, but it's clear. Whereas in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, West Virginia, the situation is often different. And those of you who've talked to me before, you've heard me say, if you have light, you have heat. And so I went and dug up some records for, well, just how much more sunlight does Elliot have in Maine than we have here in Ohio. And on average, he has 4.5 more days per month, 7 days per month from February to April, sunny skies, than we have here in Ohio. Now, as a physiologist, a person who works with plants, does 4.5 to 7 days per month matter? Yeah. I think it does. Okay? So as we get into additional discussions on what the limits are for high tunnel production, we do have to contend with where we're growing. And I think that will come out. So, Otho, I'll turn the mic over to you.
Thank you, Matt. I think it's very clear from the beginning that there are no clear answers to everything about high tunnels. And as I stand here the next few minutes, I'm not going to give you all the final answers either, because they just aren't there. There is one thing, though, that I think we can say rather dogmatically, Ted. If you take a seed, a live seed, a petunia seed, or a pumpkin seed, vastly different in size, they all have the potential for a tremendous amount of growth. And what we want to do is to remove all the impediments to that growth, because the seed is there, the potential is there. All we have to do is help it along. And that's where high tunnels come in. So if we talk about the limits on high tunnel production and what's realistic and what's the profit, it's going to vary from place to place, person to person, market to market. But yet some of the principles are absolutely the same no matter where you are or what you do. The principles are the same. High tunnels, as Ted has already defined them, unheated greenhouses, metal posts and bows, one layer of greenhouse plastic, manual ventilation, no permanent heating system, and depending on where you are, they're non-taxable. And that's a big event in some places. So I just let me ask you, how many think you have to pay taxes on high tunnels? Anybody here? Oh, that's good. Because in New Hampshire, where I'm from, just 3 years ago, a law was passed that high tunnels are no longer taxable. Before then, they were, based on local towns. But as far as I know, they're non-taxable. Who needs a high tunnel? If you live in any area where the night temperature drops below 65 degrees, you need a high tunnel. If the night temperature drops anywhere below 65 degrees, any time of the year, you need a high tunnel. I think it covers about everybody, doesn't it? Even in July and August sometimes, the night temperature might be right on the verge. So what we're talking about is a system that removes those so-called impediments of low temperature as one factor to give us some type of sustained increased growth. And I think the high tunnels fit that bill. There is no more versatile facility for your type of growing than a high tunnel. Well, you can use an inverted milk jug, right? And it will help you because that has the greenhouse effect. That's a principle. Or if you want to go to the upper scale, you can do what NASA is doing. The the people who go to the moon. They're growing vegetables in space. But can you imagine what a pound of lettuce might cost? And guess who's paying for it, you know? So somewhere between the milk jug and NASA, the high tunnel fits very nicely, I think. So I think this is what we're interested in. Well, before 1900s, over in Paris, this was a familiar scene out in the fields. Over 10,000 glass cloches. That's sort of a high tunnel, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of high. I'm sorry I didn't have a color camera back when that picture was taken. I wasn't there, but can you imagine all those glasses? And you put them on a wagon, and you know the horse or the ox might get a little rough, and they all break. I don't know. But this is some of the beginning, but it's the same principle of light passing through the substance, warming up the air, warming the soil, and then they ventilate. So this is one of the beginning stages of a high tunnel. I just want to talk a little bit about some of the principles, just for briefly. A plant is all about chemistry. Chemicals make up 100% of a plant. Light and temperature have a powerful impact on how these chemicals react. There is not a single thing in a plant, not one single thing, that is not chemical. We talk about bad chemicals and talk about pesticides and chemicals in plants and so forth. I know that's a good discussion. But we have to remember, every single thing in a plant is chemical. They're all put together in a certain way. They react in a certain way. But they're all chemical. So what we do in terms of light and temperature especially has a big impact on those chemicals. Just for illustration, this is the way you write out what chlorophyll is. This is how scientists put it on paper. There's magnesium in the middle, there's nitrogen, there's carbon, hydrogen, and all of these things go into making up chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is what accepts light. So if you have a plant that is sort of yellowish and should be dark green, photosynthesis will not be as good. So it's all chemical. So we're trying to, in effect, control the chemistry of the plant. And the environmental factors that influence plant growth, light, which is energy, by the way, the quality and the duration of the light, temperature, day and night, water from both the soil and the air, because they make a big difference. It might be high humidity. And then in soil nutrients, it could be N, P, K, and so forth, but also there are nutrients from the air, like carbon dioxide and some oxygen. It could be some nitrogen. So these are the primary elements that impact plant growth. And these are the four, when they're put together in the exact right balance, you can always guarantee a plant. That's dogmatic, Ted, okay? It'll never fail. If you put these four factors together in the right balance all the time, you'll be guaranteed a plant, assuming you don't let the cutworms or some disease get to it or weeds crowd it out. The question is, what's the right balance? And can a high tunnel fit that bill? Well, we go back to NASA. They put all four of these factors together, but it costs a tremendous amount of money to do it. So with a high tunnel, we have to do the best we can, but there are some principles even there. Life here on Earth is solar powered. I got that out of a book. The sun is the source of energy. Light is energy. And sometimes we think of light as just shining on a plant, but it's not that. Light is made up of all these wavelengths. And I got this on the end here. It's a photon. There's these things poking at you all the time. Very, very fast. Or it could be very, very slow. Low energy. So you can think about the top one here being like a baseball coming down the pike from a pitcher. It really moves fast. Or you take maybe me just lobbing a softball. Very low energy. So what we're looking at here is energy, and why is that important? Because we talk about the chemistry. When the energy hits that plant, it is actually doing something to the chemistry of the plant. Let's first use an example about greenhouse plastic. Most of today's greenhouse plastic, all greenhouse plastic today is UV resistant, ultraviolet light. The energy in ultraviolet light is like this, and energy is extremely powerful. So when the light hits the chemistry of plastic, and by the way, plastic is chemistry too. When the light hits the chemistry, it separates the bonds. It separates the elements in the plastic and it breaks down. There is a chemical glue, you might say, that holds the plastic together. And this high energy splits that apart and it breaks down. The same thing happens on a plant. Certain things happen because of the energy. It's not just simply because light is shining on the plant. A plant is a factory. Through the processes of photosynthesis, a plant grows. That is, it increases in both size and weight. Carbon is removed from the air and is converted into carbohydrates or sugars, the product that we eat or use. So carbon dioxide in water with light equals carbohydrates and oxygen. Well, what we're doing really, we're taking the carbon out of the air, we're converting it into the plants, and that gives us the plant weight. So what we do to that plant by light and temperature particularly makes a big difference in how well this factory works. And I just wanted to mention, when you grow a head of lettuce versus a tomato plant, there are two things going on here. When the leaf of the lettuce is growing, photosynthesis is taking place, and all the carbohydrates that are produced go into that leaf of lettuce or any other vegetative part. So you are growing lettuce based on the light energy. Now on tomatoes, you have a tomato plant that's green, and you also have the fruit that are basically red. There's very little photosynthesis going on in the tomato fruit. It's all happening in the tomato leaf. So the plant is growing on the basis of what hits the leaf. And then those tomato fruits literally suck off the carbohydrates from the leaf, and that's how they develop. So that's why in the wintertime, it's very difficult to grow a fruiting type crop in low light, because there's not enough energy to grow both the plant and the fruit at the same time. Whereas with the vegetative crops, the greens and so forth, there's enough energy there to grow that crop. So you've heard about if you grow a tomato crop in the spring, you get X number of pounds. If you grow the same crop in the fall, you get about half that much. Well, that relationship holds pretty well because it takes more energy to grow tomatoes than it does to grow, say, leafy crops. So here's the process. You go from the mechanical with high tunnels. That affects the environment, light and temperature, and that affects the biological, the photosynthesis. And now we're trying to control all of that through the high tunnel. What's the purpose of a high tunnel? It's to modify the air temperature, soil nutrition, water. And then on the external part, it keeps out the rain, the wind, hail, and even animals, birds, or whatever. So we have two parts going on here, the internal and the external. But the most important ones are the air temperature and the soil temperature. That will impact growth more than anything else, assuming we have enough light. So here's a picture of a greenhouse. This is a hydroponic greenhouse. Everything is meticulously controlled. And barring some unforeseen disaster, you can always predict what you're going to get. This picture actually was taken in Arizona, where they have a lot of light. But year after year after year, of course, this is certainly not organic in any sense, and it's all in artificial media. And everything's done just right, usually just about 4 fruits per cluster. You can always depend on what you're going to get if you control those factors the way they do. However, it takes about $500,000, to set up this acre of greenhouses. But at least you can predict based on what they do. Now we come to the other part, which is just the opposite of a hydroponic. This is Ed Person in New Hampshire. He is a farmer and also the manufacturer of high tunnels. He's done a tremendous job over the years in developing these systems, and then he started making the tunnels because he didn't find what he wanted. So Ed Person has done a great job, and he has the roll-up side here, you can see. And from a high tunnel perspective, I think he's been one of the leading growers in the whole nation up to this point. And ventilation, as I mentioned earlier, is very, very crucial, not only the roll-up side, but you need something to get up through the roof of the house if you can, get some air moving up. These are rather expensive. I think you can find them in Farm Tech for, $150 to $200, but they're expensive. Yet at the same time, they can be a very good insurance on a hot day when the temperature goes up high and tomato blossoms or maybe pepper blossoms are damaged by the high temperature. So I'm not suggesting necessarily this type of a panel or vent, but there needs to be something, if possible, so the air can get up and move out the top. And the other pictures have been shown today about low sidewalls and in a space, and air coming out the sides perhaps, not just at the bottom. But ventilation is so crucial. And one of the things that you always run into, I think, in a high tunnel, or the possibility is, and on tomatoes, is early blight. I know later on there's going to be some information about diseases, but I just want to mention a couple of things. What are the limitations on a high tunnel? One limitation is if you don't manage it, it's not going to work. If you don't ventilate, it's not going to work because there are too many diseases that will happen under high humidity and high temperature conditions. So if you're not willing to go out every morning, as I would say, and roll those sides up so you can provide ventilation and come back in the afternoon and roll them down to entrap the heat. If you're not willing to do that, then I don't think you need a high tunnel. If you don't have time to do it, then it's probably you should get a greenhouse with the vents and exhaust fans and so forth. But high tunnels require daily ventilation every morning. And the early blight is a good example. These are outdoor tomatoes. Early blight, and you can see from there how bad those plants look. And just 300 feet is a high tunnel. The sides are rolled up high. Ventilation, and this is what you get. No early blight. Outdoors, the plants are completely decimated. Indoors, there's no early blight. There might be one little speck here or there. The key is ventilation. So I repeat again, a limit on high tunnel use is ventilation. If you can't ventilate, it's not going to work very well for many crops. So I'll get back to what I said earlier this morning. A high tunnel then should be pretty close to where you live or move or have traffic. You don't want a high tunnel a mile away. You might do that okay, but a tunnel's better off if you can get up in the morning at 6:30, 7 o'clock, go out and roll the sides up. And make sure the humidity is flushed out, make sure the temperature doesn't shoot up very high, because you well know that if you have the sides rolled down on the greenhouse, it only takes a few minutes of high-intensity sun to get the heat right up there. So every morning, this is a commitment I think that you have to make with a high tunnel. And I mentioned temperature at night. Until the night temperature gets to be 65 degrees, you should roll those sides down every afternoon, at least on the warm season crops. Otherwise, they're not going to they won't be beneficial for you. You've got to roll the sides up in the morning and roll them down in the afternoon if you're going to make them work. And then when it comes to water, and this has been mentioned, high tunnels are sort of different. You have a cover 12 months a year. And if you're not careful, they can dry out, especially down deep. And so you need to make sure that you water thoroughly with trickle irrigation or whatever you use. And I think, from what I've seen, raised beds are better than flat. And if the raised bed then is covered with plastic, that's even better. Because if you have this type of ventilation, this type of irrigation here, a lot of that is escaping right into the environment of the high tunnel, creating higher humidity, which you have to get rid of. So I suggest that you cover up the irrigation if you possibly can to maintain all the humidity below the plastic instead of above. In New Hampshire, we've always put plastic over the whole surface, but I'm not sure that's what you have to do. The main thing is to keep the humidity levels down by, if you can, minimizing the amount of evaporation. Sure, the plant is always transpiring, is creating water, but at least try to minimize it by covering up the soil with plastic. The most important part of the plant, in one sense, is the root. If you don't have good roots, you're not going to have a good plant. You've all seen bonsai. You've seen these 100-year-old plants in little tiny dishes, right? You know what dwarf apples are. It's because of the root system, primarily. If you have a small root system, you're going to have a small plant. If you have a root system that is waterlogged, and that therefore you don't want to overwater, or if it's cold, the roots are not going to grow. So this is very important in terms of a high tunnel. So how then do you get around that problem? Well, to a large extent, crop growth is determined by root growth. If the soil is cold, root growth is restricted. Black plastic helps to warm the soil. So the black plastic really does three things. Whether you put it over the whole ground like we've done at times, or over individual rows. The black plastic warms the soil. It keeps the moisture down in the soil. Actually, it conserves moisture, but it also prevents high humidity. And then it keeps down weeds. Weeds are very critical in a high tunnel. I don't know, in some places I've seen weeds that are very high simply because farmers haven't had time to do the weeding. And weeds can be very, very competitive. Of course, if you use trickle irrigation along each row, and if you keep the aisle dry, you have fewer weeds. But I think in a greenhouse tunnel, in a high tunnel, where you have warm season crops like pepper, tomatoes, or melons, or maybe even squash or whatever, you do need to use plastic for that purpose because it makes a big difference in soil temperature. Here's a couple of pictures I took in Alaska to illustrate the concept. If you just simply put a greenhouse over this, or high tunnel over this, you'd have a perfect high tunnel. You have the irrigation system, you have raised beds with plastic, you have a warmth developed in the soil from the plastic and the raised beds. So I'd suggest in a high tunnel that you use the raised beds. Oops. There's onions on raised beds. So in a high tunnel, I think this would be the concept. So we're working on principles, and they're the same everywhere you go, whether it's inside or outside. The principles of plant growth and plant biology are about the same. So here's an idea that you could use, and the raised bed concept I think is very good. And so now let me just add one other thing about the raised beds. It's been mentioned earlier. On site selection, by all means, if you're in a flat area, you might want to simply raise up the area. It might take a bulldozer to do it. You might raise up the area so you will always have good drainage, especially in the wintertime when the ground freezes and there's a sheet of ice on the ground, and then if there's any snow melt at all, it just simply runs into the lowest point, obviously, and that's going to be the high tunnel. So raise up the level of the high tunnel, the whole thing, if possible, and especially where you have several lined up together. So you don't want the water draining into the high tunnel, because then you have cold roots, you have waterlogged roots, and also you need boots, okay? So raise it up, good drainage, whatever it takes. You'll never, never regret it, I can tell you. Because I've seen, I've experienced it, one thing, where the ground freezes and the water runs in. And I've seen a few farmers who are literally up to their ankles in mud for that same reason in the late fall, early spring. So raise it up, make sure you have good drainage. And then here again, I show another picture of melons, and could be, or the cucumbers, the melons. They really love the warmer soil as well as the warmer air temperature. So if you can warm the soil, all the better, because it's going to be a much better crop. And then this illustrates the A-frame, the Gothic type structure on the high tunnel. I highly recommend it. And as I say, I've experienced the Quonset when they go in, but with the A-frames, they withstand the heaviest snows that I've seen at 18 inches. Okay, an 18-inch snow just slides right off. But yet you need to get outside and get that snow away from the sides. So what are the limits on a high tunnel? Just to reiterate, the limits are that you got to manage them. They're not worry-free. They're not work-free. It takes more energy, in a sense, to manage a high tunnel than it does a greenhouse, by far. And yes, you might say they're cheap, they're easy to put up, and all of that. Well, that's not quite right. You have to manage them to make sure that everything is covered. And growing winter greens, this is Elliot Coleman on January 16th. It's nice and cozy in there. On the outside, it's a little bit cold. But shorter days and lower temperatures increase days to maturity and require more fuel. There has to be a positive market incentive to grow during the winter. You have to somehow make a profit during the winter. It might be nice to grow greens. It might be romantic to grow them, but you got to have some money too, right? So think about shorter days, less growth. Higher temperature, higher fuel bills, more expensive. Where are you going to market the crop? Well, I've heard some farmers say when the first frost comes, they're really happy, shut down and rest for the winter, So maybe that might be the approach that you want to take. Or use a high tunnel for an alternative. A high tunnel should be profitable. Storage or no use is more profitable alternative than growing a crop that loses money. So maybe use it for something else. Don't be tied down to necessarily having to use it all year round. But at the same time, I'm not trying to minimize the fact that you don't want to make a profit, because you've put a lot of money into these high tunnels and the price is going up because of high cost of steel. But at least use them in a way that they'll make money for you. You don't be a slave to the tunnel works for you. And it all depends on all kinds of situations. It might be that you have a good market during the winter, but if you don't have a good market, you might want to think about using a high tunnel. And their returns per square foot, we got tomatoes, we've mentioned that, flowers, greens, cucumbers, root crops. Then I've also mentioned asparagus that Ted mentioned. They certainly do this a lot in other countries, asparagus. Sweet corn, pumpkins, probably not profitable. But as we've discussed before, all these crops grow well. It's just a matter of making them grow well enough so they make money for you and not the other way around. I took this information, data is courtesy of Ed Person in Lidgewood Farm in New Hampshire, Moulton Borough. And the way he does things might be different than you, but here's what he gets, the way he does it, based on his growing practices and his market. Tomatoes, $4.15 a square foot. And cut flowers, $4.01. He's got right down to the penny. And jingle pepper, $2.50. And sandwich onions, $1.58. So in his situation, his farming style, his marketing style, this is what his returns are. Now this is gross, it's not net. But he still thinks tomatoes is his number one crop. He rotates among high tunnels. He rotates crops in the fall and the spring. And yet he's, to my knowledge, has had no trouble with tomato diseases. So, well, this might be a different story about okra, You might want to think about marketing it before planting. There's a gentleman over here, he says he loves to grow okra. But how many okra plants do you need before you've saturated the market, you know? And I love okra personally, and okra grows fantastic in a hot tunnel. The only problem is if you're going to go into the okra business, just extend your sidewalls way up there. You have tree okra. It really grows prolifically. But think about it. Do you have a market for okra? You know, that's just a principle. That's true of every single crop that you might grow. Think about your market. Think about some odd things too. What are the limits? Well, maybe there are no limits in some cases. But I've already illustrated some limits. If you don't have a market at all, why grow it? And as a final slide, just to cheer you up, you know, flowers do well and they're also pretty. And I think from my experience in New Hampshire, starting out growing vegetables, you know, the tomatoes and the pepper and the melons, people have really gotten excited about growing flowers because the colors they seem to be so more vibrant in a high tunnel than outdoors. And they grow longer and better and all of those things. So I think people are really excited about growing flowers in high tunnels. And apparently it's quite profitable. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Otho. Is Robert Hirschberger with us? Do I see? Care to comment on the flower side of things? If I could put you on the spot very briefly. I mean, we have Keith, and I don't want to, again, I'm probably being unfair to you, but if you wouldn't mind, I mean, just your general experience with flowers.
Well, my experience with flowers is we grow flowers in the spring from plugs, also some from seeds, do some of our own cuttings. And yeah, they're nice to look at, just what he said. We take them to the produce auction, sell them through the auction, and make out fairly well. Kind of got me off. He kind of got me off guard, so I really don't know what to say more about that.
I put him on the spot, and I was a bit unfair, but in this continuing search for what to grow, I think I've heard several times over, and it probably just trumps everything: grow what you can sell, or sell it before you grow it, almost. And as we get into the other issues related to integrated crop management, which we're going to start getting into here right next, rotation is going to be one of them. And of course, I think Andy Critton, a number of people at Penn State and other places around, Keith included, they bring flowers into the rotation with vegetables. Okay? Of course, the point being, at least in some of this, we don't want to put the cart before the horse, but if you rotate with a wider range of crops, the soil-borne disease issues might be minimized. So be creative, be thorough in exploring what crop options you have, because at least from my standpoint, and I might be speaking off out of turn here, but vegetable farmers tend to be vegetable farmers, and flower farmers tend to be flower farmers, and that makes a lot of sense because they're each demanding in their own way. But if a flower farmer and a vegetable farmer can get together, or if you can do both well, then those issues related to soil-borne disease management might be minimized.